Well, it's a real pleasure to be here today. Today I'm going to tell two narratives. One is I'm going to tell you about our research using psilocybin-assisted psychotherapy with cancer patients and our preliminary results. And then I'm going to tell a story that's a little bit similar to Michael's. We have a planned study at NYU to use psilocybin-assisted psychotherapy for alcoholics. So disclosures, I'm a member of the Hefter Research Institute, and I received my research funding from NIDA, Hefter, and the NYU Langone Medical Center. So I have an 11-year-old son, and he's been doing montages at school, so I think I borrowed from him because it's more entertaining to tell a story in pictures. And so pop quiz. Now, when I did this is the story of the history of psychedelics to treat addiction, and I'm going to tell the story today by going through these rows, and some of you are sitting in the audience. So who's that right there? So that's William James. Dave Nichols, who's that? That's Arthur Hefter. Who's that? That's Carl Jung, Bill Wilson, Albert Hoffman. Right, so this is I'm going to tell a story here, but then the next story here, who's that? Humphrey Osmond, you know that guy. Sidney Cohen, that handsome man, Walter Pankey, Stan Groff. And I won't go through the rest here, but I'm going to come back to this picture. Now, there's another picture here. This has to do with the use of psychedelics in terminal cancer. And that's a young Irving Yalom. And you can notice when I did all these pictures, I realized it's mostly men, all men, right? So what I did for the ladies is I went through the history of psychedelic women, right? So you got to do that. Yeah. So who's that? Maria Sabina, who's that? Valentina Wasson, right? She's very important. Betty Eisner, UCLA. Loretta Bender, who's the first psychedelic researcher at NYU. Who's that? Laura Huxley, Helen Bonney. Who's that? That's a young Ann Shulgin, yeah. And Mary Kuzamon. I'll talk about Mary today because I had dinner with her and it was a lot about love. There's a lot of love going on. And Annie Mithofer. And all of these people here are part of our NYU team. They are therapists, and then we have Alicia, and we'll go through all these people here as well. Okay. And some more pictures. So I'm going to talk about the serotonergic hallucinogens today, and the indole alkylamines include the drugs like ayahuasca and psilocybin and LSD, and the phenylalkylamines, the prototype is mescaline. And you guys have heard a lot about a mystical experience. You know, when I was a psychiatric trainee, I didn't hear anything about psychosis that had a positive valence. If you talked about having unitary experiences or being transcended to another place, a time in reality, we would call that psychosis, and in the Bellevue ER, we would admit you inpatient. So mystical experiences provoke a kind of crisis of nomenclature within psychiatry. How do you define these kinds of alterations of consciousness that have a positive attribute to them? So I think we need a better definition system. And to think about psilocybin is very interesting because it's doable in the laboratory. It's very hard to sit there from 8 in the morning to 5 at night to do a session. And I think if we did LSD, my wife would divorce me, you know, because I'd be home too late. So with psilocybin, it's doable within the laboratory setting, but still hard to sit there. Now, we have two neuroimaging teams, one in Switzerland and one in Great Britain, that have come to two different conclusions in terms of what happens when you give psilocybin. Franz Vollenweider's team gave oral psilocybin and found marked activation of prefrontal cortical regions and temporal medial cortex. That was interesting. This was PET, because the group at Imperial College of London, and I feel like today's lecture I'm going to say a lot of like ditto or what he said, because a lot of these lectures have been given. So I think Robin is here in the audience, so he's going to talk all about this. But this was interesting. This was IV psilocybin, and what they found was deactivation of prefrontal cortical regions, not activation. And interestingly, they found deactivation of the default mode network, and when they did functional connectivity, there was increased connectivity between the default mode network and the task positive network, which is something that you see in certain states of psychosis and meditation, and Robin's going to talk more about that. But these were divergent findings, and the more we learn about the neurobiology of psychedelics, it's really, really interesting. So these drugs are all Schedule 1, and by definition, that means there's no accepted medical use. There's lack of safety for use under medical supervision, and these drugs are of the highest addictive liability. So we're going to go back in history to take a look at this and to look specifically at the serotonergic hallucinogens to understand how addictive they are or not. All right, so back to history here. So back in the early days of psychopharmacology, what did the great psychopharmacologists did? Well, they all self-ingested, right? That's what you did. People got in trouble later for doing that, and we don't do that anymore. But both Arthur Hefter and Louis Lewin got samples of mescaline and self-experimented. And Louis Lewin was so intrigued by it all, he wrote a book, Fantastica, which I think is probably the most apt term of all these terms that come hard to truly describe these states. So this was the beginning of research in psychedelics from an academic perspective, and there was some interest in mescaline that endured, but essentially things picked up again in Switzerland in 1943. So we had Albert Hofmann, who was a Swiss chemist at Sandoz, and you all know the story, but he accidentally, while trying to make these ergot derivatives to help women that had blood loss during pregnancy, happened upon these lysergamides. He made them in 38, but in 43 he had some premonition to go back and accidentally dosed himself and discovered LSD. He went back to Sandoz, and they started testing LSD among each other, among animals, and they found that it had no known toxic dose. And in 47, Sandoz makes LSD and makes it available to psychiatric researchers and psychiatrists throughout the country, which starts this interesting experiment of psychedelics within academia. And people thought that these states are similar to psychotic states, so there was excitement about understanding the biological basis of psychosis. And in addition, the psychoanalysts, this was the heyday of psychoanalysis, and the analysts loved it because they were constantly looking for the royal road to the unconscious, and dreams was the one mechanism to do that, but this was the real sort of royal road, and had some favor among the analysts, especially in the European models. So articles start to appear with LSD. LSD is brought to the United States. Work begins in Boston and Los Angeles. And a very interesting time, psychiatrists start to self-administer LSD. Psychiatry clerkship organizers take LSD with their medical students. This happened at places like UCSF and NYU. So the medical student or the psychiatrist could have empathic resonance with the mind of the psychotic patient. So it was an interesting time to go to medical school. And psychiatrists started using it clinically. I mean, it was not only available through research, you could get it. And I'll tell the tale of Oscar Janiger in Los Angeles. He gave it to thousands of people, including celebrities, etc. So it becomes available and is used clinically. And then, of course, the CIA gets involved to try to weaponize hallucinogens. And very interestingly, Gordon Wasson is a banker in New York, but his wife Valentina is an amateur mycologist, and she is looking for this agent that's used by indigenous cultures in Mexico, and that's about all she knew. In fact, she thought that it may be peyote. There's something about these agents historically where they create a lot of excitement, and then something happens and they are repressed, and it's happened throughout time. It's happened within academia, and we now are sort of need to learn from the past to not repeat it. But they went to Mexico, and they found Maria Sabina. And Gordon Wasson and Valentina become the first Westerners to undergo a psilocybin experience. And Gordon Wasson was friends with Albert Hofmann. He sends the mushrooms to Albert Hofmann. He isolates the psychoactive alkaloid, psilocybin. And then Life magazine in like 1957 does an article about all this. And Timothy Leary reads that and takes psilocybin in Cuernavaca. And in 1960 starts the Harvard Psilocybin Project. And we'll talk about the Spring Grove group as well. But, and I'll get to Humphrey Osmond a little bit later, but he does a lot of work with alcoholics in Canada. And this was part of mainstream academic psychiatry. Most psychiatrists, when they ask them about LSD, they say, 7 hits makes you insane, it's a very dangerous drug. None of them have any clue that this was part of American psychiatry for a considerable period of time with a considerable number of research participants that were treated. And they ended up being hundreds of patients and tens of thousands of participants. And there's 2 models that emerged, and that's been discussed. This really was the psychedelic dream team, and Bill Richards is here in the audience. This was this amazing team that was assembled at Spring Grove that I think if the work continued here, we would have psychedelics as medicines now for a whole host of conditions. This really was the right way to do it. They had a multidisciplinary team. They did a cancer study by working with an oncologist who sent all of the patients. And these were a team of very experienced psychiatrists and psychologists. And unfortunately, before things really got cooking and going well here, it all came to an end. So what did happen? Unfortunately, the agents escaped from clinical laboratory research settings and they went out into the public. And the American public, I don't think, was ready. It was end of the 50s, and there was a lot of political turmoil. And what happened is LSD was started to be used by the mass public. And these drugs are not drugs that should be used indiscriminately by anyone. They have a downside and a danger. They're sacred medicinal compounds that should be used in a certain kind of setting and only with certain kind of individuals. And the problem is, they're created problems. So people that are predisposed to psychosis, the 18-year-old who goes to college and tries LSD for the first time and becomes psychotic, and that starts his schizophrenia. Even though LSD does not cause schizophrenia, there were a lot of casualties. Richard Nixon got very concerned about this, and essentially the Controlled Substance Act of 1970, which was the beginning of the war on drugs, which really has been a disaster for addicts because we've taken a medical illness and criminalized it. And in many ways it was because there was a grave concern about what these consciousness-expanding drugs were doing to the American public. And so this system was put in place in 1970, and we'll talk about if the serotonergic hallucinogens really belong in that category or not. But at the end, there were 1,000 articles, tens of thousands of participants. And interestingly, as Michael mentioned, alcoholism was the most studied indication. If you take Humphrey Osmond by himself, he did open-label trials. There were several thousand alcoholics, and if you look at the other trials in the U.S., there were close to 1,000 people and about 536 in the well-designed trials. Methodology of use and setting were all put in place, and safety was determined. That most of the serotonergic hallucinogens, except maybe ibogaine, are incredibly safe from a medical perspective. They have very low physiologic toxicity. The main problem has to do with the adverse psychological effects, and if you properly screen individuals, the safety data is very robust, both historically and also in the last 40 years, the 400 so participants that have received psilocybin in the United States, there have been no major serious adverse events, which is a testament to the safety of doing this in a clinical setting. And I won't go over this, you've heard this enough. Hopkins, I'm going to show a dose-response study that they've done recently to kind of get a sense of what the optimal dose is. And interestingly, a new therapy model. When I was training as a psychiatrist, there was you as the psychiatrist, and there's the patient. One doctor, one patient. But interestingly, they developed a model of two therapists and a dyad team, usually male, female. And there was therapy training that went on. In fact, Jeff Gus is going to talk about our psychedelic psychotherapy training program at NYU, but it's an interesting model of training two therapists, and this is how Jeff does it. We go to Hawaii, and this is the final ceremony. You get to sit by the water, I wish. But two therapists, one patient, which for me has been very interesting to take a look at that. And this is the psilocybin that we have in our study. It is 1 gram that's stored in a 1,000-pound safe. It's the only substance that's stored there, and here's a compounded pill. This is our treatment room, and this is the Hopkins treatment room, and this is exactly what the methodology the 50s to 70s was, that comfortable living room-like setting, two therapists. In many ways, we have sort of like left off from the old group. But people always ask me, why two therapists, why male, female, why music, why introspection, and I don't know, because they said